Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, February 29th, 2024. When the Jewish people commit the terrible sin of the Egel, the golden calf, in this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Tissah, Moshe immediately begins to pray to God to forgive them. But, this sin is so blatant, so inexcusable to directly disobey the words that they heard directly from God just 40 days earlier. We would expect that if Moshe is going to pray for mercy, for forgiveness, there would be some humility, there would be some begging, especially from Moshe, Anav Mikol Adam, the most humble of all men. But Moshe's approach to God is exceptionally brazen. Moshe actually delivers to God an ultimatum. Vayashav Moshe el Hashem vayomar. Moshe turns to God and he says, as soon as he hears what the Jewish people have done, Ana chata ha'am hazeh chata gedola. Yes, it's true, God, that these people, the Jewish people, they have done a terrible sin. Vayasu lehem elahei zahav. They made for themselves a golden idol, a golden god. That's what the pasuk says. V'ata, now Moshe says, Im Tissah chatasem, you must forgive them. V'im ayin, and if you're not willing to forgive them, m'cheni na misifracha asher kasavta, take me out of the book. Erase my name. I want no part of this. It's incredible. After what the Jewish people have done, and you come to approach God with an ultimatum where you demand that God has to forgive the Jewish people? I mean, like it's obvious that they should be forgiven for such a terrible sin? The approach that Moshe takes is bizarre. And more than that, listen to the comment of Rashi, which is even more difficult to understand. Rashi says, when Moshe says the words, "Macheni na misifracha," take me out of your book, Moshe, it means, is saying to God, if you don't forgive the Jewish people, take my name out, mikol kula, from the whole Bible, from the whole Torah. That's it. I want nothing to do with the whole thing. Why? Shelo yomru alai, because people will say, I was not worthy to be able to pray for the Jewish people that they should be forgiven. If I don't succeed, it makes me look bad. People are going to say, Moshe didn't succeed at saving the Jewish people. Hold on a minute. Come on. Now this is about Moshe's ego? Again, the Torah itself says Moshe is Anav Mikol Ha'adam, the most humble of all people. And Moshe's worried he's going to look bad? If God doesn't submit to what is objectively Moshe's outrageous demand to forgive the people for the terrible sin of the golden calf, and Moshe's worried how his reputation will suffer? So I want to share with you an insight that I heard from Rabbi Melech Biederman, and it is an insight that should inspire every single one of us. Moshe was the humblest person in the world. He considered himself unworthy to pray for forgiveness for the Jewish people. And precisely for this reason, he cried to God, if you won't accept my prayer to forgive the Jewish people, people will say, well, of course, God did not forgive the Jewish people because the plea came from Moshe, who was unworthy. Had the plea come from someone greater, who was worthy, God would have granted the request, because God only answers the prayers of a truly worthy person, not just anyone. That is what Moshe feared that people would say. And that idea is not only false, it is dangerously false. A person should never think that, because it is not true. Because God is Shomea Tefillah, one who hears prayer, the prayer of everyone, without exception. No one is so far removed from God that God doesn't hear their prayer. This, by the way, is the central message of Sefer Yonah, the book of Jonah, that we read on Yom Kippur afternoon. You remember the narrative. Yonah is a prophet, and God comes to Yonah and says, I want you to go to Nineveh to prophesy a message that I want to give to them. And Yonah does not want to do it, so he runs away in the other direction to Tarshish. He gets on a ship. The ship is in the sea, and there's a storm, and it appears that the ship is going to sink. Vayomer Alehem, and Yonah says to the other sailors on the ship, Su'uni vetiluni el yam, lift me up and throw me overboard. Vayishtok hayam alechem, and then the sea will calm down. You will not be in danger. Ki yodea ani, because I know, Yonah says. Ki b'shali hasar hagadol hazeh alechem. It's because of me that this great storm has come upon this ship. It's my fault. Vayisu es Yonah, and the sailors reluctantly lift up Yonah. Vayatiluhu el hayom, they throw him into the sea. Vayomod hayom mizapo, and the sea becomes calm. The waters become calm. Vayiman Hashem dag gadol, and God had prepared a great whale, livloa es Yonah, to swallow Yonah. Vayihi Yonah b'me'ei hadag, and Yonah existed in the belly of the whale, shlosha yamim u'shlosha leilos, for 3 days and for 3 nights. Now listen carefully. Vayispalel Yonah el Hashem Elokav, and Yonah prayed to God, mime'ei hadaga, from the belly of the whale. Now, that phrase that Yonah prayed to God, mime'ei hadaga, from the belly of the whale, is meant to be understood literally if the Navi is describing a literal narrative, figuratively, emotionally. Yonah is as far away from God spiritually. Yonah is at the other end of the earth, so to speak, from God. Yonah has distanced himself from God. Yonah is at the greatest distance that it is possible to be from God, in the worst place imaginable. Mime'ei hadaga, and it is from this worst place, after having done this terrible thing, to run away in the opposite direction. When God tells him to go here, he goes there. And it's from this terrible place, physically, emotionally, spiritually, from this place, Yonah prays. And listen to what he prays. Vayomer, and he says, Karasi mitzaro li el Hashem vayaneni. I called out to God in my distress, and God will answer me. Mi beten sha'ol shivati shamata koli. From the belly of the depths, God will hear my prayer and God will answer me. And God did listen to Yonah. And that's the point of the narrative. That's why we read this narrative on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, to remind ourselves of this message. That there's no such thing as a person who is so far removed from God that God does not hear their prayer. No matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter in what circumstance you find yourself, we can always pray to God. And so Moshe says to God in our Torah portion, because I am unworthy, you must accept my prayer to ask for forgiveness for the Jewish people. To demonstrate that God cherishes and responds to every prayer of every person, regardless of merit, regardless of worthiness. And if you don't do that, God, Moshe says, for whatever reason, if you decide not to forgive the Jewish people, Moshe says, "Macheni na misifrecha," take me out of your book. It would be better to remove my name from the entire Torah. No mention of Moshe's name anywhere. It would be better for that to happen, so that people would not get the wrong idea and think that God forbid, that God does not accept the prayers of people who make mistakes. And had it been a greater person, God might have listened. Because that would be such a terrible mistake. It would be such a terrible untruth. Moshe is saying to God, it would be better to take me out rather than someone come to that erroneous conclusion. Every one of us must know with certainty that every time we sincerely approach God in prayer, God accepts and cherishes our prayer. Whoever we are, whatever we have done, Shelo Yomru, don't ever say, Lo hayisi kedai levakesh rachamim, I wasn't worthy to be asking for mercy. No, never. You are kedai. You are worthy. You are worthy, whoever you are, whatever you have done. God is waiting to hear from you. At some point, next Shabbos, not this Shabbos, but the Shabbos after, when we read the Torah portion of Vayakel, and the week after that, when we read the Torah portion of Pekudei, and that is the end of Sefer Shmos, the book of Exodus, at some point during those two Shabbos mornings, if you're in synagogue, you're going to ask yourself the following question. Why do we have these two Torah portions, Vayakel and Pekudei? They are completely and totally redundant to the two portions we had before, Truma and Tetzaveh, which give us all of the details of the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the items that were there, the dimensions, the materials, every detail was given to us in those two Torah portions, Truma and Tetzaveh. Why do we have the repetition of the exact same material in two more Torah portions, next Shabbos and the Shabbos after that, Vayakel Pekudei? In fact, you could take the entire, both portions of Vayakel and Pekudei, and you could condense them to one pasuk. One verse, could you imagine? One pasuk. And that's the entire Torah reading for two Shabboses. Because we already know every single detail that's in these two portions, Vayakel and Pekudei. Every detail of the Mishkan, the utensils, the garments, the materials, the dimensions. And the entirety of these last two Torah portions, Vayakel, Pekudei, could be condensed to one pasuk, which is actually near the end of Pekudei, where the Torah says, K'chol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, according to all that God commanded Moshe, Kain asu b'nei Yisrael es kol avoda. The Jewish people did all the work for the Mishkan exactly as God had commanded. Vayar Moshe es kol hamlacha, and Moshe saw all of the work that was done to build the Mishkan, and all the utensils and all the objects. V'hine asu osa kasher tziva Hashem, and they had done the work as God had commanded. Kain asu, so did they do it. Vayivarach osa Moshe, and Moshe blessed them. That's the whole story. That's the encapsulated version of the entire 2 portions of Vayakel Pekudei in one pasuk. There's several answers to this question, but I want to share one answer tonight that involves the narrative of our Torah portion, the Parsha of Tissah. Let's take a step back. When did God decide to command the Jewish people to build the Mishkan, this sanctuary that would travel with them through the desert to be the Ohel Moed, the place of meeting between God and the Jewish people, and when they got to Israel, eventually it would become the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem? When did God decide to command building that? And that question is connected to why did God command building the Mishkan? Now, there are 2 basic approaches among the commentaries. One is the Ramban, Nachmanides, and the other is Rashi. The Ramban says that it was always God's intention, always God's plan to command the Mishkan right after the revelation at Sinai. The Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai. They heard God reveal himself and speak to them the Aseret HaDibros, the 10 Commandments. That moment of revelation at Sinai was so overwhelming. It was a moment that was such a climax. It was a once in all of human history event. And God wanted a way to continue the moment into history. God wanted to be able to find a way to continue that moment of closeness and intimacy, but elongate it, continue it through the Mishkan, which would be an Ohel Moed. It would be an ongoing meeting of God and the Jewish people. So it was always God's plan that immediately after Sinai, God would command building the Mishkan. And we discussed this opinion before, a while ago. This explains the order of the Torah portions in the second half of Shemos, which are in chronological order, according to the Ramban. We have the portion of Yisro and then Mishpatim. Both of those Torah portions contain the narrative of the revelation at Sinai. Then, immediately we have the Parsha of Truma, where God commands building the Mishkan, and Tissah, where God continues with the other utensils and building of the Mishkan and the garments of the Kohen Gadol and the high priest. So, Yisro, Mishpatim, Truma, Tissah, that's in chronological order. Immediately after the revelation, God commands building the Mishkan. Then there's a bump in the road. There's a bump in the road, our Torah portion, Tissah. The Jewish people build a golden calf. Okay, that's a problem. Because in our Torah portion, when the Jewish people build the golden calf, God is so angry, the first thing God says is, I'm just going to get rid of the Jewish people and start over again. Well, if God forbid, is going to get rid of the Jewish people and start over again, there's no reason for a Mishkan. So that kind of puts the whole thing on hold until finally, in our Torah portion, Tissah, Moshe convinces God to forgive the Jewish people. Okay, now we're back on track. Once we're back on track, we have the next 2 portions, Vayakel and Pekudei, where the work is done and the structure is put together and set in place. Okay. Rashi has a different approach. Rashi says that these Torah portions are not in chronological order. God's original plan did not include commanding the Jewish people to build the Mishkan. Now, the truth is, if we're honest, the Mishkan is theologically problematic. Can God really be contained in a building created by human beings? Does God really need our animal sacrifices? Remember, we discussed before the Kruvim, the two cherubs, in the Kodesh HaKadosh, in the Holy of Holies. There were two statues made of pure gold of angels. One had the face of a man, the other had the face of a woman. Hold on a minute. You're telling me in the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, on top of the Aron, the ark that holds the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments, there were two statues, one with the face of a man and one with the face of a woman? Explain to me how that's any different than building a golden calf. The whole thing, from a theological point of view, could be seen as too close to comfort to idolatry. And so it was not God's plan to command building a Mishkan. But after the Jewish people did build the golden calf, after they sinned with the Egel HaZahav, God realized that the people could not sustain the pure abstraction of God, to worship a God that we cannot see, we cannot know, we cannot perceive. It's too abstract. And that was the sin of the Egel, the golden calf. They needed something they could see. They needed something tangible. So when God saw this, let's call it a weakness within the Jewish people, God commanded to rechannel that approach into a visible structure of the Mishkan, which would be a vehicle to serve God, not, God forbid, an idolatrous practice, but a vehicle, a visible, physical vehicle to be able to serve God. Okay, so the Mishkan was, so to speak, God giving in to the human nature of the Jewish people. Once God saw that they had sinned with the golden calf, God says, okay, at least this will be better. We'll rechannel the energy and command building a Mishkan. And this Mishkan will be the location where God and mankind can meet, this Ohel Moed. Now, according to Rashi, all four portions, Truma, Tissah, Vayakel, Pekude, the four portions that describe, repeatedly, every detail of the Mishkan, all four of those portions were after the golden calf, right? Because God only commanded building the Mishkan in response to the golden calf. So the chronological order of the Parshios is Yisro, Mishpatim, Revelation and Sinai, Tissah, the sin of the golden calf, then Vayakel, Pekude, Truma, Tissah, Vayakel, Pekude, all the details of the Mishkan, which is a response to the golden calf. That would be the chronological order. But Rashi says, and before I get to that, and there is strong support within the Torah itself for Rashi's approach. For example, now I'm going to read several verses to you, and I'm going to be reading them out of order, but that's kind of the point, that the Torah portions, according to Rashi, are out of order. But listen to these. In the portion of Truma, The very beginning where God commands building the Mishkan. V'asu li migdash v'shachanti b'socham. Build for me a sanctuary that I can dwell among you. Now that verse appears to be an antidote to the following verse, which is in our Torah portion. In our Torah portion, in the aftermath of the Egel, the golden calf, Moshe yikach es ha'ohel, Moshe took his tent, v'natalo michutz lamachaneh, and he moved it outside of the camp, away from the rest of the Jewish people. The Jewish people had done such a terrible sin, even though Moshe was one praying for their forgiveness, but he was still disgusted by what they did. And so Moshe took his tent and he moved it away from the people. And when God spoke to Moshe, God was speaking to Moshe away from the Jewish people. Then, when God commands the Mishkan, God says, "V'asu li migdash v'shachanti b'socham," make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. Well, that seems to be responding to the Egel. There's a sin of the golden calf that causes a distancing between God and the Jewish people, and God commands the Mishkan to be a fixing of that distancing to bring God back together with the Jewish people. That's how it seems. In the Parsha of Tissah, the Torah says, in describing all of the garments worn by the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and then the Torah describes, this was last week's Torah portion, Tissah, the Torah describes the sacrifices that would be offered. And the Torah says, V'zeh hadavar asher tasa lehem l'kadesh osam, l'chahen li. This is the sacrifice that you should offer to initiate the sanctification of this Mishkan that I'm commanding you to build. Lakach par echad, take one bull, one par, one cow, and offer it. Says Rashi, why was this offering offered? L'chaper al ma'aseh ha'egel, to serve as an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. Again, it appears that the Mishkan comes in response to the golden calf. That's what Rashi is saying. Furthermore, one last point. The role of the Kohen and the Levi, the tribe of Levi, to be chosen to be the ones to serve, that only happens after the sin of the golden calf. Remember, in this week's Torah portion, the tribe of Levi did not participate in the golden calf. They were exempt from any punishment. Up until the time of the golden calf, it was the Bechar, the firstborn of each family, that were the priests and the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people. But they were replaced because the firstborn had sinned with the golden calf. The tribe of Levi did not. They were divided into Kohen, priests, and Levites. That only happened after the golden calf. Now, of course, what I've quoted to you is all out of order, but that's the point. What Rashi is saying is, the Torah portions, the way we have them, are not in chronological order. Because the Mishkan was commanded as a response to the golden calf. And therefore, so why are the Torah portions in the order that they are? Says Rashi, it's thematic. It's not chronological. It's a thematic connection. What's the thematic connection? Even though the order should be Tissah, then Truma, then Tetzaveh, then Vayakel and Pekudei, we have Truma and Tetzaveh first, and then Tissah, and then Vayakel Pekudei. Why do we have that order? Well, there's several answers to that. I shared one last week in the name of Dr. Tursky. Dr. Tursky writes that the Torah wanted to place Truma, God asking for donations of gifts, of material, to build the Mishkan, to be connected to immediately follow the portion of Mishpatim, which contains a lot of Jewish civil law, laws of honesty, not stealing, to make the point that if you're going to donate something that's going to be used to build the Mishkan, make sure it really belongs to you. Make sure you earned it honestly. Make sure you did not steal it. Don't think that because you donate something for a worthy cause, it somehow excuses the unethical way that it came into your possession. Okay, so that's a thematic reason why Truma and Tetzaveh should be next to Mishpatim, even though it's out of chronological order. Okay. But according to both Rashi and the Ramban, the last two portions, Vayakel and Pekudei, are in chronological order. It's just that according to Rashi, the golden calf in our portion is the impetus for the entire project of the Mishkan, including the next two portions, Vayakel, Pekudei. According to the Ramban, the Egel, the golden calf, was a setback after God had already commanded building the Mishkan, but it gets overcome. God forgives the Jewish people, and then Vayakel Pekudei, the Mishkan, which had already been commanded, is built and it's put together. But we're left with this central question. According to both Rashi and the Ramban, why are these next two Torah portions, Vayakel Pekudei, so long and so repetitious? The central mistake that the Jewish people made in building the Egel Hazav, the golden calf in our Torah portion, is that the people decided for themselves how God is to be served. The problem is, that's not our decision. God decides how God is to be served, and God said, no graven images. So even if we think we have a good reason to violate that, maybe because we don't know what happened to Moshe, that's one of the opinions. Even if another way is more meaningful to us, it speaks to us, it's not our call. It's God's call. And that was the mistake of the Jewish people in building the golden calf. And that is what God needed to correct with the Mishkan and later with the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Now, there is a textual formula, a textual theme that runs through these next two portions, Vayakel and Pekudei. It's so strong, it's repeated 21 times. 21 times in the next two Torah portions, Vayakel, Pekudei, it forms a leitmotif. Goes like this. Next week's Torah portion, Vayakel. So, Vayomer Moshe el kol adas b'nei Yisrael lemar. Moshe says to the Jewish people, this is what God commanded. Chum idchem truma l'Hashem. Take a gift for God. And each person should bring a gift of gold and silver and copper. This is completely repetitive from what we read 2 weeks ago in the Parsha Truma. And then the Torah says, Vayasru, and they did, Eis kol asher tziva Hashem. Everything that God commanded. The Jewish people did everything that God commanded. Over and over and over again. In the two portions, Vayakel Pekudei, the last two portions of the book of Shemos, over and over again, after each section, the Torah says the same words, Kasher tziva Hashem, just as God commanded. 21 times that phrase is repeated. Until the final time. Near the end of the Parsha of Pekudei, the verse I read to you before. Finally, K'chol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. According to all that God had commanded Moshe, Kain asu b'nei Yisrael es kol avoda. That is exactly the work that the Jewish people did. Vayar Moshe es kol hamlacha. Moshe saw all the work that was done. V'hinei asu osa, and he saw that they had done the work. Kasher tziva Hashem, as God commanded. Kain asu. That's how they did it. That's time number 21, repetition number 21. Vayivarech osa Moshe. Moshe blessed them. And then, and only then, Vayichas he'anan es ohel moed. And the cloud of glory descended on the tent of meeting. Uchvod Hashem, and the glory of God, moleas Mishkan, filled the sanctuary. God's presence rested within the Jewish people. And with that lesson learned, the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmos, ends. The sin of the Egel, the golden calf, has been fixed. The book of redemption is complete. And the lesson for us is clearly and firmly established. God decides how to serve God. My friends, I want to wish you a great evening and a beautiful Shabbos. And I look forward to seeing you soon in person.